Hi guys, tonight we'll drift into one of the strangest and most whispered stories to ever come out of the Cold War. A tale known simply as the Russian sleep experiment. It's a story that blurs the line between rumour and reality, between what science might have tried and what fear has imagined. Was it a real experiment buried in secrecy, or just a legend born from the shadows of paranoia? Let's begin quietly and see where the night takes us. If you appreciate calm, reflective journeys through forgotten times, don't forget to tap like, subscribe, and share in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing where these stories are reaching, and tell me, what hidden story should we uncover together next? In the late 1940s, deep in the Soviet Union, research into human endurance was reaching unsettling depths. Scientists were obsessed with one question: how long could the human body and mind function without sleep? Sleep was seen as a weakness, a vulnerability that interrupted productivity and control. In an age driven by ideology and competition, rest itself began to look suspicious. So somewhere beyond the known laboratories, far from the cities, a facility was said to exist, an anonymous building hidden among endless birch forests, accessible only by a single gravel road, and guarded by silence. Those who worked there did not speak of it later, or if they did, their stories were dismissed as ghost talk. The experiment, according to fragments of classified notes that later surfaced online, was simple in design but brutal in implication. 5 political prisoners were promised their freedom if they could remain awake for 30 days. To achieve this, the scientists developed a special gas mixture meant to suppress sleep, keeping the subjects alert without causing hallucinations. At least that was the theory. The chamber was sealed: thick glass, steel walls, a narrow window for observation. There was enough food, water, and books to last a month. The lights never dimmed. The constant hiss of gas filled the air like an invisible tide. Microphones captured every whisper, every cough, every breath. For the first few days, everything appeared stable. The men spoke normally, even cheerfully, their conversations drifting from politics to family to childhood memories. The scientists monitored the data with fascination, noting that alertness seemed unaffected. By the 5th day, though, the tone changed. Speech became slower, laughter rarer. The subjects began pacing endlessly, sometimes standing still for hours, lost in thought. Their bodies remained awake, but their minds seemed to drift somewhere else. The researchers, tired themselves, took turns watching through the window. Some claimed the men started talking to people who weren't there. Others said they sang softly to themselves, lullabies, military songs, fragments of poems. Yet the strangest part was the stillness that followed. The air grew heavy, the gas hissed, and the human mind, deprived of dreams, began to unravel in silence. Most official records of the Soviet sleep studies mention nothing about such an experiment. No names, no dates, no archives. But small details, fragments in declassified psychology papers, hint that something close might have taken place. A note from 1949 references continuous wakefulness subjects showing irreversible behavioural deterioration. Another from 1951 mentions failure of sleep deprivation containment. Were these related or merely coincidences written in the language of bureaucratic vagueness? The truth perhaps lies not in the reports, but in what they chose not to say. The idea of staying awake for 30 days was not entirely new, even then. The military had long experimented with stimulants and isolation, trying to keep soldiers alert through endless hours of watch duty. But what made this alleged Russian study so unusual was its ambition, not merely to measure exhaustion, but to observe what happened when sleep itself was erased from the human experience. The chamber became a small world of its own, cut off from natural light, temperature changes, or sound beyond the hissing air. It was said that the scientists even filtered the air pressure slightly above normal, so the subjects would feel a faint, constant tension in their lungs. Nothing dramatic, just enough to keep them uneasy. Around the 6th or 7th day, the observers began to notice subtle shifts in behaviour. The men stopped sharing their food equally, one hoarding portions of bread in his pockets. Another began muttering about dreams coming through the walls. When asked, he insisted that he wasn't dreaming, but remembering something that hadn't yet happened. The researchers recorded it as nonsensical speech pattern, likely due to fatigue. Still, one doctor circled that line twice in his notes. As days stretched into nights, though the subjects no longer knew the difference, the sense of time eroded completely. The prisoners began to forget small things, their names, where they had been arrested, what day it was. Yet they remembered details of the chamber perfectly. Every sound, every shadow, the exact rhythm of the gas hiss. It was as though their perception had turned inward, mapping their surroundings in microscopic precision, while erasing everything beyond the steel walls. In some versions of the story, the scientist tried speaking to them through an intercom. The men responded politely at first, then with irritation, then not at all. They whispered among themselves instead, voices low, sometimes laughing softly at things that weren't funny. One researcher later described it as watching consciousness fold in on itself. Meanwhile, the team outside faced their own exhaustion. They took shifts, smoked endlessly, filled notebooks with numbers and pulse readings. There was no excitement, no outburst, only the creeping realization that something fundamental about the human mind was being exposed, something they could not easily interpret. Around day 10, a strange calm settled over the room. The pacing stopped. The whispering faded. The men simply sat, eyes open, unmoving. They were not asleep, but neither were they fully awake. One blinked once every minute. Another seemed to forget how to swallow until water dripped down his chin. The gas continued to hiss. The light remained steady. The experiment went on, but the silence was becoming unbearable. By the 11th day, the observers began to sense that something inside the chamber had shifted beyond comprehension. The data still looked consistent, heart rate steady, breathing rhythmic, gas levels normal, but the atmosphere felt wrong, as if the silence had its own weight. The men rarely spoke now. When they did, it was in fragments, small strings of words that drifted away before forming meaning. They stared at the walls, or into the air, or sometimes directly into the small window where the researchers watched. One technician swore that one of the subjects seemed to follow his eyes through the glass, even though the observation room was completely dark. The logbook from that night recorded a single note. Subject appears aware of observer presence through opaque barrier. No explanation was added. On the 12th day, one of the men stood up suddenly and began reciting something that sounded like a list. Numbers, names, places, repeating over and over. Another joined in, echoing him, until the noise became almost musical. The microphones captured it all, the strange rhythm pulsing through the speakers. It didn't sound angry or afraid, only methodical, like a chant built from broken logic. The scientists argued whether to interrupt or let it continue. Eventually they decided to observe. After a few hours, the voices stopped abruptly, leaving only the hiss of gas. Then came the laughter. It started faintly, as if someone were trying to remember what laughter was supposed to sound like. One man laughed, then another, until the chamber was filled with it. But it didn't feel joyful. It was hollow, disconnected from any real emotion. One observer described it as a sound made only to confirm existence. When they were asked through the intercom why they were laughing, no one responded. The laughter simply faded, replaced again by stillness. By the 13th day, the experiment had become a ritual of quiet observation. The scientists watched, listened, and documented without understanding what they were seeing. One of them, a younger assistant, wrote in his private journal that he had started dreaming of the chamber while asleep, hearing the hiss of the gas in his own room at night. He stopped sleeping after that, afraid of what he might see behind his eyelids. Inside the chamber, the men's physical condition began to change. Skin grew pale, lips dry, eyes dull but wide. They moved only when necessary, slow, mechanical motions like marionettes remembering their purpose. The constant exposure to the gas seemed to preserve their alertness, but their humanity was fading in ways no chart could record. It was not madness exactly, nor illness, but something colder, quieter, the gradual erasure of personality. The scientists realized they were no longer observing sleep deprivation. They were witnessing what happened when the barrier between waking and dreaming dissolved completely. By the 14th day, the experiment's progress reports became shorter and more uncertain. The official data, pulse, respiration, temperature, remained strangely stable, but the subjective notes filled with hesitation. Words like unresponsive, withdrawn, and self-directed muttering appeared repeatedly. The subjects were no longer communicating in a way that could be analysed. When the intercom was used to ask them simple questions, "Are you comfortable? Do you need food?" there were long silences before faint, indistinct replies emerged. Sometimes the responses didn't match the questions at all, as if the voices speaking were unaware of who they were addressing. It was as though each man had slipped into a private world, one that overlapped only faintly with reality. One night, around hour 350, one of the observers noted that the temperature inside the chamber had dropped slightly, despite the equipment reading normal. They double-checked the seals, the filters, the gas lines. Nothing had changed. Still, the air seemed colder, the sound of the hiss sharper. Some claimed the lights flickered for a moment, though the power systems recorded no interruption. When the researchers looked through the glass, all 5 men were standing perfectly still, facing different corners, their eyes open but unfocused. None of them blinked. The scientists were divided. Some argued the gas should be reduced gradually to observe how the subjects would respond. Others warned that doing so might disrupt whatever fragile state of balance was keeping them alive. For now, they decided to continue exactly as planned. On the 15th day, one subject moved again. Slowly, he sat cross-legged on the floor and began to trace something with his finger on the metal surface. Shapes, circles, lines that connected in patterns. The others eventually joined him, each choosing a wall or the floor, marking with fingers, sometimes with water from their cups. The microphones picked up faint scratching sounds, irregular but deliberate. When one of the scientists asked what they were doing, a voice answered, quiet and steady, writing it down. The team didn't understand what "it" referred to. The marks themselves were later described in surviving notes as non-linguistic, geometric, possibly symbolic. That same evening, one of the senior researchers, Dr. Belinsky, suggested introducing a controlled stimulus, music, perhaps, or a spoken message, to gauge reaction. But when he played a short radio broadcast through the intercom, the subjects all looked up at once, perfectly synchronized, and stared directly at the window. They did not move or speak, but something in their gaze unsettled everyone watching. It was not hostility, but awareness, a collective recognition of the observers on the other side. Blinsky turned off the broadcast. The men returned to their stillness, and the gas continued to hiss. From that moment on, no one in the observation team was able to shake the feeling that the experiment was no longer one-sided. By the 16th day, the research facility itself seemed to change. The sterile air that once smelled of disinfectant now carried a faint metallic tang, like cold machinery left running too long. The observers moved more quietly, spoke less, and avoided standing alone near the glass window for too long. Even the hum of equipment began to feel oppressive, as though it were part of a pulse no one could escape. The subjects inside the chamber, however, remained calm, too calm. They sat or stood motionless for hours at a time, occasionally glancing upward as if listening to something beyond the reach of human hearing. It was not the behaviour of exhaustion, but of deep focus, as though their consciousness had turned inward completely. The scientists debated whether to end the trial early. Officially, the protocol required a full 30 days, but already the project was becoming a burden to everyone involved. The younger technicians whispered among themselves that the gas had done something irreversible. "They're not tired because they're not here anymore," one of them muttered, half joking, but no one laughed. On the 17th day, a quiet incident occurred that was left out of the official reports. During a routine calibration, one of the engineers accidentally opened the audio feed from the microphones without realizing it was still transmitting. For approximately 8 minutes, the researchers outside heard nothing at all. No movement, no breathing, not even the hiss of the gas. Then a soft whisper came through, a single voice repeating a phrase in Russian. The translator later described it as something like a prayer, but directed inward. The audio ended abruptly when the line was closed, and when they rechecked the feed, all 5 men were awake and seated exactly as before. Later that night, one of the senior observers, an older physiologist named Kirov, refused to continue his shift. He said the men were aware in a way that isn't human anymore. When asked to clarify, he simply said, "They look like they've remembered something we've all forgotten." He left the facility the next morning and never returned. Around the 18th day, subtle technical problems began to appear. Equipment readings flickered unpredictably, though maintenance found no electrical faults. The temperature sensors inside the chamber reported values slightly lower than those measured manually. The gas filters clogged faster than expected, as though the atmosphere itself had thickened. And yet, despite these irregularities, the subjects remained physiologically stable. Their heart rate slowed, but evenly. Their food consumption decreased, but not drastically. They drank water but showed no signs of dehydration. It was as if their bodies had found a new rhythm, one independent of fatigue, hunger, or sleep. The researchers tried to categorize it: adaptive trance, psychogenic stasis. But the words meant little. In the control room, Belinsky wrote in his notebook, "We're not studying wakefulness anymore. We're witnessing another state of being." That night, for the first time since the project began, the lead scientist ordered that the chamber lights be dimmed slightly. No one knew why. Some said it was for the subjects' comfort. Others believed it was for their own. By the 19th day, the chamber had become eerily quiet again. But the silence felt charged, like the air before a storm. The dimmed light softened the edges of the room, and for the first time since the experiment began, shadows reappeared on the walls. The subjects did not react at first. They sat in stillness, as if indifferent to the change, but after several hours subtle movements began. Small, deliberate gestures, fingers tracing invisible lines in the air, lips forming words without sound. The researchers took notes mechanically, though none of them could explain what they were seeing. The cameras caught every detail, but when the footage was reviewed later, the motion appeared slower, as though time itself were bending within the chamber. No technical explanation could be found. One of the scientists, a linguist assigned to monitor verbal patterns, noticed that the subject's occasional whispers seemed to follow a structure, repeated phonemes, rhythmic intervals, almost like a primitive language forming on its own. She compared the sounds to fragments of Slavic dialects but found no match. When she tried to analyze the audio spectrogram, the waveform displayed a consistent harmonic vibration outside normal vocal range. It wasn't noise exactly, but something structured, like the resonance of a tuning fork. She wrote in her report, "This is not random. They are speaking in alignment." On the 20th day, one of the subjects approached the observation window for the first time in nearly a week. His face was calm, his eyes clear, but something in his expression unsettled everyone watching. He leaned close to the glass, breathing softly, and whispered a single phrase. The microphones caught it perfectly. "How long have you been awake?" The control room froze. It was unclear whether he was addressing the scientist or someone else entirely. No one responded, and after a moment the man turned away and sat down again. The team argued whether to increase the gas pressure or reduce it. Belinsky overruled them, insisting that no change be made. "We're observing equilibrium," he said quietly. To interfere now would destroy the data. But deep down, most of them no longer believed they were recording scientific data at all. They were watching something evolve, or dissolve, beyond their comprehension. Around the 21st day, the first signs of physical decay appeared. The men's nails had grown abnormally long, their hair brittle, their skin showing faint discolorations like frost patterns. Their pupils, once normal, now reacted sluggishly to light. Despite this, their movements remained coordinated, their strength seemingly undiminished. One subject lifted a chair and held it suspended in his hand for several minutes, without strain, then set it down as though testing gravity itself. The observers kept their distance from the window. Several reported vivid dreams when they tried to sleep, all sharing the same detail: the sound of slow breathing behind glass. One technician refused to return to his post, claiming he woke up gasping, convinced he had forgotten how to close his eyes. The lead physician noted this incident in his journal, but underlined one sentence 3 times. The observers are beginning to mirror the subjects. By the 22nd day, the facility had grown heavy with exhaustion and unease. The line between observer and subject was thinning. The scientists no longer spoke loudly in the control room. Every word seemed to echo down the sterile corridors, as if the walls themselves were listening. Most of the staff were surviving on caffeine and anxiety, their own sleep cycles shattered by the constant vigilance of the experiment. The men inside the chamber, however, looked eerily composed, pale and motionless, yet not lifeless. It was as though they had discovered a way to exist beyond fatigue, and the researchers, ironically, were the ones falling apart. That morning, one of the cameras flickered, then went dark for 7 seconds. When it came back online, all 5 subjects had shifted position simultaneously. They were now seated in a perfect circle, their hands resting on their knees, eyes closed but open just enough to reveal the whites beneath. The gas still flowed, unbroken. The data feeds showed no interruption, but when the scientists checked the sound monitors, they heard something faint beneath the hiss. A low hum, rhythmic and continuous. It wasn't speech, it was tone. Some compared it to throat singing, others to the vibration of wind through hollow metal. Whatever it was, it carried an unnatural precision, as if timed by a single heartbeat shared among them. The linguist returned to analyse it again, noting the pattern had shifted from random murmuring to synchronised resonance. "They've found a frequency," she said quietly, "and they're holding it." No one could explain what that meant. The hum continued for hours, steady, unwavering. At times, the lights in the observation room seemed to flicker in sync with it, though the electrical grid was stable. By evening, one of the assistants collapsed from exhaustion. He had not slept in nearly 3 days and muttered as they carried him to the infirmary, "They're calling us to listen." When he awoke later, he could not remember saying it. Inside the chamber, something subtle but undeniable began to occur. Condensation formed on the glass, even though the temperature remained controlled. The frost spread slowly, tracing shapes similar to those the subjects had drawn earlier on the walls. The team wiped the surface, but the patterns returned minutes later, shifting slightly each time, as though responding to observation itself. On the 23rd day, a decision was made to collect biological samples. The chamber's airlock was briefly opened to slide in collection tubes. No one entered, of course, but as the mechanism sealed, the microphones caught a faint collective whisper, "Don't disturb it." The words were calm, almost tender, and perfectly synchronized across all voices. The room fell silent. No one moved for nearly a minute. When the samples were analyzed later, they showed nothing abnormal. Same blood composition, same oxygen levels, but the gas filters revealed trace elements of something unrecorded, a compound resembling altered nitrogen. The chemist stared at the results and murmured, "Either the gas is changing them, or they're changing the gas." That night, Belinsky wrote one line in his private log. "We wanted to measure sleeplessness. Instead, we opened a door." The 24th day began with a strange quiet. The technicians described it later as a silence with a pulse, as if something invisible were breathing just beneath the normal soundscape of the lab. The hum that had filled the chamber for nearly 12 hours was gone, replaced by an almost sacred stillness. The men inside were motionless again, seated in the same circle, their faces lifted slightly toward the ceiling. The gas continued its faint hiss, constant and different. One of the observers remarked that they looked like statues carved from sleep itself, not dead, not alive, simply existing between the two. The facility director, summoned from Moscow for inspection, arrived that morning. He was a quiet man named Dr. Mikhailov, known for his precision and his lack of superstition. Yet even he hesitated before approaching the observation window. He stood there for a long while, saying nothing, and finally asked in a low voice, "Do they still speak?" Belinsky shook his head. "Not since yesterday." The director nodded once. "Then it's time to end it." His tone was firm, but his eyes betrayed uncertainty. The order to terminate the gas flow was scheduled for midnight. The team prepared protocols, sedation units, containment teams, medical evaluation. But as the day progressed, the atmosphere grew heavier. Several devices began to malfunction. First the temperature sensors, then the intercom. Each failure was random, transient, and unexplained. The engineers blamed aging equipment, but no one truly believed that. The gas meters flickered briefly, displaying unreadable symbols before returning to normal. It was as if the instruments themselves were trying to communicate something they could not express. At 23:59, the first vent began to close. The hiss softened, fading gradually into the air. The subjects did not react. The observers leaned forward, waiting. When the final valve sealed, there was no sound at all, only the steady hum of the facility's lighting. Then, at exactly midnight, one of the subjects opened his eyes fully and looked directly into the camera. The motion was slow, deliberate. His lips moved, though no sound came. The linguist, watching the silent footage later, claimed she could read the words, "Why did you stop?" Panic rippled through the control room. Belinsky ordered the gas restored, but the system refused to respond. Alarms blinked without noise. The manual override jammed. For nearly 5 minutes the chamber remained sealed, soundless, breathless. Then, unexpectedly, the gas resumed on its own. No one had touched the controls. The lights inside the chamber flickered once, twice, and steadied again. All 5 men were now awake, standing in unison, facing the window. They did not speak. They simply watched. The director left the facility that night, returning to Moscow by dawn. He left no written report, no recorded comments. When asked later by internal investigators what he had seen, he replied only, "We tried to measure what it means to be awake. We found out there's more than one kind of waking." The experiment continued, but something fundamental had changed, not just inside the chamber, but in the people who studied it. The 25th day began beneath fluorescent lights that never seemed to rest, yet the entire facility felt darker somehow. The men in the observation team avoided each other's eyes, performing tasks mechanically, like actors repeating a play they no longer understood. The subjects had returned to silence. They stood for hours without motion, facing different corners of the chamber, breathing in unison. One technician swore the men's chests rose and fell at the same time, perfectly synchronized, though no one wanted to verify it. Even the gas meters seemed to pulse in rhythm with them. The scientists, once skeptical and methodical, had stopped debating theories. No one mentioned psychology or physiology anymore. It had become something closer to superstition, an effort to maintain order in a room that was slowly unravelling reality. Around midday, Belinsky noticed faint distortions on the camera feed, subtle bends in the image, as if the air itself were rippling. The recording equipment showed no interference. When he adjusted the lens manually, the distortion vanished, only to reappear seconds later. He leaned closer, staring through the static, and thought for a moment that one of the men was smiling. Not a wide grin, just the ghost of expression, as if acknowledging him. The smile lingered long enough for Belinsky to look away. Later that afternoon, the linguist returned with her latest analysis of the tonal hum that had occurred 2 days earlier. She'd discovered harmonic intervals matching brainwave frequencies measured in deep meditation. They weren't just making noise, she explained quietly. They were aligning their neural patterns. No one responded. The phrase sounded absurd, yet in that room filled with sleepless people studying those who no longer needed sleep, it didn't feel entirely impossible. That night, one of the external guards reported hearing faint knocking sounds coming from within the observation corridor. When checked, nothing appeared unusual, but when the microphones were boosted to maximum sensitivity, they recorded a sequence of taps, 5 slow beats, a pause, then 5 more. Morse code specialists were called in briefly, but the pattern didn't translate into any known message. The recording ended abruptly when one of the subjects placed his hand on the glass. Around the 26th day, strange reflections began to appear on the observation window. The scientists at first assumed it was glare from the monitors, until one technician swore he saw a face that wasn't his own staring back at him. When he stepped aside, the reflection did not move. The others dismissed it as fatigue, but after that no one stood directly in front of the glass for long. By evening, the team noticed that the subject's lips were moving again. No sound came through the microphones, but the motion was unmistakable, slow, synchronized, deliberate. The linguist filmed it, later comparing the footage to phonetic movements in multiple languages. Her conclusion was chillingly simple. The men weren't speaking Russian, or any language known to humans. They were repeating a single shape of thought, over and over, as though reciting an idea that existed beyond words. In the early hours of the 27th day, Belinsky wrote one last note in his private journal, before resting his head on the desk, eyes open, too tired to blink. If they have found a way to live without dreams, what happens to the rest of us who still need them? When the 27th day began, the air in the facility felt heavy enough to taste. The metallic tang that had lingered for days had deepened into something stranger, like ozone after a thunderstorm. No one could explain it. Every sensor reported normal readings, but the staff moved slower, as if gravity itself had thickened. The chamber lights glowed with a dull amber tint, and condensation once again gathered on the glass, outlining faint patterns that shifted every few minutes. The scientists stopped wiping it away. They were afraid of what they might reveal beneath. Inside, the 5 men remained standing, eyes open, faces calm. Their posture was unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that belongs to deep water rather than living flesh. Their chests rose in quiet rhythm, yet their breathing made no sound. By midday, small inconsistencies began to appear in the digital recordings. Video files would replay with missing seconds, as if the system had blinked. Audio logs picked up faint murmurs layered beneath the normal feed, each containing voices that matched the subject's tones but said words no one remembered hearing. "It's like the data is dreaming," the linguist said, staring at the playback. Her comment earned no reaction. By now, the entire team operated in a state beyond fatigue. They no longer questioned whether the experiment should continue. They simply obeyed the momentum of it, as though the project itself had become self-sustaining. At 18 hours, the lights in the observation corridor flickered again. When they stabilized, the men inside were no longer in their previous positions. They were now lying flat on the floor, arranged in a star-like pattern, their heads touching at the center, arms extended outward. The symmetry was precise, geometric, intentional. One observer gasped and crossed himself. Another began muttering that the formation resembled ancient ritual diagrams used in early neurology experiments. Belinsky, pale and trembling, whispered, "Don't record this." But the cameras were still rolling. For 3 hours nothing changed. The gas continued to circulate. Then, at 21:07, one subject sat up. Slowly, without urgency, he turned toward the camera and pressed his hand to the glass. His fingers left no print, only a faint shimmer that lasted a second too long. The microphones detected a low vibration, the same frequency identified days earlier in their hum. It pulsed twice, then faded. The man smiled faintly. the same calm, detached expression that had haunted Belinsky before. When the night shift took over, they found the day team asleep at their stations, heads resting on notebooks, eyes flickering beneath their lids. None of them remembered closing their eyes. One technician dreamed that the chamber was empty except for a soft light breathing in the dark. Another dreamed of standing inside the room, unable to tell whether he was one of the scientists or one of the subjects. In his final entry for that day, Belinsky wrote in the margin of a technical report, "We designed a chamber to remove sleep. What if we removed more than that?" The ink trailed off mid-sentence, smudged by what looked like the faint impression of a fingertip, as if someone had leaned over the page to read it before it dried. By the 28th day, the experiment had become less a study and more a haunting. The team no longer gathered for scheduled briefings. They drifted in and out of the control room, moving quietly, afraid to make sudden sounds. Even the hum of the generators seemed subdued, as though the entire building were holding its breath. The subjects had not spoken in nearly 40 hours, but their presence filled every corner of the facility. One could feel them, even through steel and glass. A faint vibration in the air, the pressure of awareness pressing outward. Early that morning, one of the technicians noticed a new phenomenon. The frost that had long clung to the observation window was gone, replaced by thin lines etched into the surface. 5 concentric circles intersected by angles drawn from the inside. The scientist reviewed security footage to see when it appeared, but the recordings from midnight to 3 a.m. were blank. No corruption, no signal loss, just darkness. When the image finally returned, the circles were already there. The linguist, now pale and trembling from lack of sleep, proposed that the markings resembled patterns found in neuroimaging, frequency maps, perhaps representing brainwave synchronization. "They're not deteriorating," she whispered. "They're adapting, maybe even merging." No one responded. The word merging hung in the air like a fog that wouldn't clear. At noon, the intercom system activated on its own. A faint static filled the speakers, followed by breathing, slow, even, and perfectly synchronized with the 5 subjects' chest movements. No commands had been issued, yet the microphones had opened. For almost 3 minutes, nothing else happened. Then, through the hiss, a soft voice emerged. "You have not been forgotten." It was calm, emotionless, and layered. 5 voices speaking as one. The staff froze, staring at the monitors. Belinsky tried to respond, but the intercom controls were locked. He pressed the override repeatedly until the static cut off. When it did, every light in the facility flickered once, then stabilized. The recording system captured none of it. The director in Moscow had not replied to their reports for 2 days. There were no new orders, no instructions. It was as if the experiment had fallen out of the world. The staff began to talk about leaving, but every attempt at evacuation was met with sudden failures. Vehicles that wouldn't start, radio transmissions lost, power surges that sealed the chamber doors automatically. It felt less like coincidence and more like the project itself was preventing them from abandoning it. Late that night, Belinsky sat alone in the control room, staring at the faint glow of the chamber beyond the glass. The 5 men were still standing in their perfect formation. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a flicker of light that didn't belong to the fixtures, something softer, pulsing within the air itself. He leaned closer and whispered, as though speaking to the experiment rather than the men inside, "Are you still human?" For the first time in hours, one of the subjects blinked. Belinsky didn't sleep that night. In his final note before dawn, he wrote, "They are not awake in the way we understand. They are somewhere between us and what dreams of us." The morning of the 29th day arrived without sunrise. The clock said 07 yours, but the outside world looked frozen in perpetual twilight. The few remaining staff members moved like ghosts through the hallways, whispering only when necessary. Even coffee had lost its purpose. It no longer woke anyone. The entire facility existed in a kind of muted suspension, as if it had drifted outside of time. The cameras still recorded, the instruments still clicked, but the act of observation had turned meaningless. Inside the chamber, the subjects had not moved in almost 20 hours, yet none appeared weak or close to death. Their skin was pale and dry, their eyes dull yet open, and their breathing continued in perfect rhythm. The gas filled the air at a steady rate, the same chemical whisper that had accompanied them from the beginning. The day's first irregularity came when the temperature gauge in the observation room began to fluctuate wildly. It swung from 10 degrees above normal to 10 below within seconds, even though the actual air felt unchanged. The engineer monitoring the system disconnected the device, thinking it was malfunctioning, but the moment he did, all 5 subjects turned their heads toward the window, in unison, slow and deliberate like marionettes reacting to a single unseen hand. They did not move again after that. The linguist spent the next several hours reviewing all recorded audio from the experiment. When she played back the faint whispers from day 19, she discovered a pattern she hadn't noticed before. Within the static, between breaths, there was a phrase repeating at long intervals. "Stay with us." The words appeared at frequencies too low for casual hearing, buried beneath the hum of machinery. "It's not just speech," she said to Belinsky, her voice trembling. "It's a call. They've been answering something." Belinsky didn't respond. He simply stared at the subjects, lips pressed tightly together, eyes hollow. That evening, at exactly 21:30, one of the external lights failed. The power didn't flicker elsewhere, only that single bulb above the chamber door. For a brief moment the darkness seemed to move, shifting across the window like a living thing. The technicians swore they saw faint shapes within it, 5 silhouettes, but not human ones, stretching and folding like smoke. The phenomenon lasted less than 30 seconds, after which the bulb reignited on its own. When visibility returned, the subjects were seated once again in their circle. Only now their heads were bowed, as though in silent prayer. The team gathered around the monitors, but none dared to speak. It was as if the men inside had reached a conclusion no one else could understand. The experiment had stripped them of dreams, of rest, of time, and still they endured. What remained within them was no longer simple consciousness, but something refined, distilled, and alien. Near midnight, the intercom crackled again. The sound was faint but unmistakable. 5 breaths, exhaled together, followed by a single phrase spoken softly. "It's almost your turn." Belinsky wrote those words down, then closed his notebook forever. The 30th day began without alarm, announcement, or sunrise. The entire facility seemed suspended in an endless, colourless dawn. The staff moved mechanically, their faces drawn and hollow, their eyes reflecting the same exhaustion they had spent weeks trying to study. Only a handful remained, those too afraid to leave and too numb to care. The chamber still glowed faintly behind its reinforced glass, filled with the same gentle hiss of gas that had become the heartbeat of the project. The 5 men inside no longer looked like prisoners or subjects. They looked like something in between, a shape that remembered humanity but had long since surpassed it. At 06:17, the lights in the chamber flickered 3 times, slow and deliberate as if in signal. Every machine in the control room paused for exactly 4 seconds. Monitors froze, pens stopped rolling, clocks ceased their ticking. When motion resumed, all 5 subjects were standing. They did not move toward the glass or speak, but the air itself began to vibrate with low frequency, like distant thunder rolling through the ground. The noise came from nowhere and everywhere at once. One of the younger researchers dropped his headset and whispered, "It's inside the building." Belinsky, pale and trembling, gave the order to terminate the experiment. The command was clear: cut power, vent gas, open the chamber, end it. The technicians moved without hesitation, but as the systems powered down, the chamber door refused to unlock. Manual overrides failed one after another, metal bolts locking tighter as though sealed from the inside. The vibration grew louder, shaking dust from the ceiling. Then, silence. Total, absolute silence. The kind that feels like it's listening. When the sound returned, it wasn't a hum this time. It was breathing. Deep, collective breathing. Not through microphones, but through the walls themselves. It resonated in the bones. A rhythm felt more than heard. The lights flickered again, and one of the subjects stepped forward. He raised his hand toward the glass and spoke clearly, his voice amplified without the intercom. "We're awake." For a moment, everyone in the control room froze. The sound was calm, unthreatening, but its tone carried something vast, like a chorus contained in a single throat. Belinsky stumbled back, shaking his head. "That's impossible," he muttered. But the data screens glowed faintly, each monitor flashing the same message in distorted Cyrillic letters. Probuzhdenie, awakening. Then, without warning, the chamber door released with a hiss. No one moved. The gas escaped slowly, rolling across the floor like a pale mist. The 5 men stood inside, eyes open, unmoving. One technician began to cry. Another whispered a prayer, and then the lights dimmed once more, reducing everything to shadow and breath. When emergency lighting finally engaged, the chamber was empty. The mist lingered only for seconds before fading. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of a clock that had stopped days earlier, but now, impossibly, had begun again. Belinsky wrote in his last surviving note, "The experiment has concluded, but not in this place. Whatever they have become, it is not sleep, not wakefulness, but a bridge. And we have crossed it without knowing." When investigators arrived at the facility days later, they found a silence so complete it felt engineered. Every hallway was pristine, every file in order, every surface dusted as if someone had prepared for guests. There were no signs of struggle or panic, only absence. The control room was intact. The equipment still ran in standby mode, lights flickering lazily across dark screens. The chamber, sealed again from the inside, stood untouched. Its glass window was opaque with frost, though the temperature remained mild. No bodies were ever recovered. The official report described the event as a containment malfunction, resulting in personnel evacuation. But the language felt too neat, too controlled. Those who wrote it never mentioned the faint rhythmic vibration still detectable in the concrete walls. Among the scattered papers on Belinsky's desk, investigators found his final notebook. Most of it was blank except for a single page near the end, covered in tight handwriting that grew more erratic toward the bottom. It contained no technical notes, no analysis, just a single paragraph. "We looked into the void between sleep and waking and found something already there. It does not dream, it waits." The handwriting stopped abruptly, trailing into an ink stain shaped like a spiral. The chamber was dismantled over several weeks. The metal walls were cut apart and shipped to separate locations under different project names. Some pieces went to research institutes, others disappeared into classified archives. But rumours persisted that one section, the glass observation panel, was never moved. Technicians claimed it refused to shatter or melt, even under extreme conditions. When engineers applied heat, the surface darkened but never broke. "It's still holding pressure," one supervisor joked nervously, but no one laughed. By autumn, the facility was sealed and left to decay quietly in the forests of northern Russia. Locals told stories of strange lights visible through the trees, of static bleeding into their radios, of voices whispering in languages no one recognized. Most ignored them. Those who went searching for the building rarely found the same path twice. Decades passed, and the experiment faded into rumour. Only fragments remained, copies of photographs without negatives, translated reports missing key pages, letters mentioning wakefulness research, and psychophysiological endurance. A few Soviet-era scientists, when interviewed years later, dismissed it all as Cold War propaganda. a myth born from paranoia and isolation. But their eyes always shifted when asked about the location. One, an elderly neurologist, simply said, "If it wasn't real, why was it locked away twice?" By the late 1990s, digital copies of alleged reports began circulating online. Scans of carbon paper, notes stamped with faded serial numbers. Most readers dismissed them as creepypasta, an internet legend. Yet some of the language matched authentic Soviet formatting, and a few terms, especially references to oxygen suppression compounds and cognitive dissociation under gas influence, appeared nowhere else in open literature. Those who tried tracing the documents found their sources vanished within months. Websites disappeared, files corrupted. It was as if the experiment resisted being remembered, as though even its story refused to sleep. In the years that followed, the legend of the Russian sleep experiment refused to die. It drifted between science fiction and whispered testimony, changing slightly each time it was told. Some versions claimed that a single survivor had been recovered, his mind fractured but alive. Others said all 5 subjects merged into one, an entity that no longer required air or light. In every retelling, though, one element remained constant: the gas. No one could identify its composition, yet every alleged document, every note, described the same characteristic: odourless, invisible, and strangely resistant to dissipation. Even after the chamber was deactivated, the compound supposedly lingered in the air for months, clinging to metal, impossible to filter completely. Western researchers, curious about Soviet human endurance projects, searched archives for clues. They found scattered references to Continuous Wakefulness Program number 84, a file supposedly destroyed in 1953, shortly before Stalin's death. The fragments described early experiments with oxygen deprivation and stimulant inhalants, but nothing resembling the rumoured event. And yet, buried in a 1952 physiology report from Leningrad University, one line stood out: "Subject maintained cognitive function at hour 4:38. No signs of fatigue. Further observation terminated at external request." No explanation followed, no name, no result. It was as if someone had erased the conclusion. By the early 2000s, interest in the story surged again. Internet forums dissected every detail, comparing linguistic styles of supposed Soviet reports, analysing photographs pixel by pixel. Some pointed to identical artifacts in unrelated documents, suggesting forgery. Others claimed metadata linked the scans to university servers in St. Petersburg. A few investigators even travelled to remote regions of Karelia, searching for remnants of the facility. They found only concrete foundations buried beneath moss and snow, yet one visitor reported hearing a low hum emanating from beneath the ground, like air moving through a hollow lung. He returned with a recording that captured only silence. Among those drawn to the mystery was Dr. Alina Voronina, a historian specialising in Cold War biomedical ethics. In 2011, she published a paper titled "The Physiology of Fear: Soviet Human Experiments Between Myth and Memory." Her conclusion was cautious. While there was no direct proof of the sleep experiment, its persistence in collective imagination suggested a deeper truth, not about one event, but about a pattern of secrecy and ambition. The Soviet system, she wrote, was capable of making the unbelievable seem ordinary. In such an environment, even the impossible leaves footprints. Months later, Dr. Voronina vanished while researching in Arkhangelsk. Police reports claimed she drowned after her car slid off an icy road into the Dvina River. But her laptop, later recovered by local divers, contained one final file: a photograph of a sealed steel door marked only with a number, 17. The image's metadata placed it in an unregistered location, 200 kilometers north of her last known position. No such coordinates appeared on any official map. To this day, the original photo remains archived under restricted access. Those who have seen it describe the faint outline of a handprint pressed into the metal as if left by someone on the inside trying not to be forgotten. The story of the Russian sleep experiment became a mirror for every age that retold it. In the early days, it was whispered as a Soviet secret, a warning about the dangers of unchecked science. Later, it became a metaphor about technology, surveillance, and the cost of progress. But beneath every version lay the same question. What happens when humanity tries to silence its most essential rhythm? Sleep, after all, is not just rest. It is the bridge between chaos and sanity, between knowing and forgetting. To remove it completely is to tear open the veil between thought and something far older. In 2013, an independent documentary crew travelled to northern Russia, hoping to locate the supposed site of the experiment. They interviewed locals in remote villages, many of whom had never heard of the story or pretended not to. One elderly man, a former forestry worker, told them quietly that he had once transported steel containers marked with radiation warnings through that region in the 1970s. The road ended in the woods, he said. They told us not to ask where the path led, but sometimes at night the air there still hums. You can't hear it, you feel it in your teeth. The team dismissed it as folklore, but when they camped near the coordinates the man described, their recording equipment captured something strange. Fluctuations in ambient frequencies, rhythmic but not mechanical, repeating at precise intervals. The footage never aired. Months later, one of the producers posted anonymously online, claiming that the sound file they recorded was identical to the resonance frequencies used in early sleep studies. His account was deleted within hours. Around the same time, fragments of a document surfaced on a darknet archive labelled Project NOSOS. The acronym, some suggested, stood for No One Sleeps or Survives. The text, written in a mix of Russian and English, referenced experiments involving neurological endurance and interference with REM state architecture. It mentioned a chemical codenamed Z54, a gas that suppressed neural activity linked to dreaming while keeping motor function intact. Cross-references to declassified materials confirmed that a compound with that identifier had indeed been synthesized in 1948, tested briefly on animals, and then discontinued after reports of behavioral collapse. Whether this had any connection to the sleep experiment was impossible to prove, but the similarities were unsettling. The legend spread across online forums, inspiring reenactments, short films, and even pseudo-scientific recreations. Yet amidst the exaggerations, small consistent details kept resurfacing. The steady hiss of gas, the silence of the subjects, the lines scratched into the wall. We're awake. It appeared again and again, as though echoing from the same unseen source. In 2018, a group of researchers analysing old Soviet microfilm archives discovered a damaged roll labelled Wake Cycle Continuation 1950. Most frames were black, but a few showed the interior of a sealed room. Lights overhead, metal walls, a table set with medical instruments. On one frame, 5 shadows appeared on the floor, perfectly spaced, though no people were visible. The team dismissed it as an optical flaw, yet the spacing between the silhouettes matched the dimensions listed in earlier rumours of the chamber. When the film was digitized, the image degraded further. The shadows moved. None of the researchers spoke publicly about the find, but one, under a pseudonym, later posted a single sentence online. The gas never mattered. It only opened the door. By the 2020s, the Russian sleep experiment had shifted from myth to modern folklore. Podcasts dissected its origins, historians debated its plausibility, and neuroscientists quietly admitted that parts of it were disturbingly conceivable. Sleep deprivation studies had long shown how quickly the human mind can fracture. Hallucinations, paranoia, micro-dreaming, but none could explain the level of lucidity described in the experiment's accounts. To stay awake indefinitely without collapse defied biology, yet so did much of the 20th century's ambition. In a strange way, the story had become an allegory for an age that refused to rest. One thread of investigation took an unexpected turn in 2021, when an archivist from the Russian Academy of Sciences, working through declassified Cold War material, stumbled upon a memo referencing Behavioral Isolation Chamber 3. The document, dated 1949, requested additional supplies for long-term containment testing and bore a signature, A. Belinsky. Experts argued the name was coincidental, common, meaningless. Yet in the margins of the memo, faintly visible, was a handwritten note. The dreamless will adapt faster. The archivist who discovered it later described hearing a soft hiss from the climate control unit behind her as she read. She laughed it off, but her report mentioned that the sound continued even after the unit was unplugged. Meanwhile, online researchers began collecting similar anomalies: unexplained energy readings, missing film reels, and eyewitness accounts of sealed bunkers in the forests north of Vologda. Satellite imagery revealed irregular clearings and heat signatures consistent with underground structures. When cross-referenced with Soviet geological surveys, one area appeared repeatedly marked as restricted. In official databases it was simply labelled Inactive Facility 12, but the coordinates corresponded to the same latitude described in Dr. Voronina's final photograph. Attempts to reach the site ended abruptly. Roads collapsed into swamp or terminated in unmarked fences. One independent journalist, posting under the alias Kirov's Ghost, shared drone footage that seemed to show a half-buried concrete dome with corroded steel vents. The video lasted only 42 seconds before cutting to black. When re-uploaded, it displayed heavy digital distortion and a continuous background hum similar to earlier leaked recordings. The journalist disappeared days later. Around this time, several scientists revisited the chemical properties of Z54, the rumoured sleep-suppressing compound. Using public data, a neurochemist reconstructed a theoretical model of its molecular structure. According to her simulation, long-term exposure might not simply prevent sleep, it could alter synaptic communication entirely, creating a feedback loop of awareness without rest, a consciousness untethered from circadian rhythm. If sustained, she wrote, the subject would no longer dream, but might perceive time as continuous. Without interruption, awareness could evolve into something self-referential. Her paper was quietly removed from publication within a week. That year, a minor earthquake struck northern Russia. Locals near the White Sea reported no tremors, only a low, resonant vibration that lasted for several minutes. Windows rattled but did not crack. Radio signals faltered, and deep beneath the frost, a disused military sensor registered a faint frequency, repeating every 7 seconds. Steady, precise, and eerily human, like breathing. Scientists dismissed it as coincidence, interference, or natural resonance. Yet a retired geologist who examined the data privately noticed something uncanny. The pulse ended exactly after 30 days. The following winter was one of the coldest in decades. Snow buried the forests where the old facility was said to lie, sealing its remnants beneath layers of white silence. Yet locals began to report strange phenomena: faint vibrations underfoot, radios crackling to life with static, dogs refusing to go near certain paths. No official investigation followed. By then, the Russian sleep experiment was dismissed as an urban legend, unworthy of state attention. But among private researchers, a quiet curiosity persisted. The rumour of a recurring breath frequency, a 7-second pulse buried beneath geological noise, drew attention from physicists and cryptographers alike. None could fully decode it, though one analyst noted that the intervals between pulses matched precisely the recorded heartbeat of an adult human at rest. In March 2022, a small expedition of university students travelled to the supposed site of Facility 12. They brought drones, seismic sensors, and enough supplies for 3 nights. Their video logs were uneventful at first: long hikes through frozen terrain, playful banter, failed GPS signals. On the second night, the cameras recorded a soft humming sound rising from beneath the snow. It wasn't wind, it had rhythm. The group joked that it sounded like a sleeping engine. Within minutes, the microphones began to distort and the footage cut off abruptly. Days later, a search team found their camp intact, equipment still warm, tents zipped shut, but the students were gone. Their notebooks contained only one entry written across several pages in uneven handwriting. "The air is awake." Authorities labelled the disappearance an accident. Yet audio engineers analysing the recovered recordings noticed something odd. Embedded within the static was a faint whisper, repeated dozens of times. It wasn't Russian, nor any known language. The waveform, when visualised, formed the outline of 5 evenly spaced peaks. In Moscow, an ageing linguist named Mikhailov, rumoured to have worked on the original project, was asked privately about the legend. He refused to speak on record, but one journalist quoted him anonymously. "There was no experiment. There was an invitation. We were the ones who answered it." When pressed for clarification, he ended the interview, whispering that the sound of sleeplessness does not end with silence. Later that year, an international research vessel operating in the Barents Sea detected an unexplained radio tone echoing across the ocean floor. The pulse was consistent with previous anomalies and repeated for exactly 30 consecutive days before vanishing. Analysts joked it was the ghost of a machine. Others weren't so sure. By 2023, the story resurfaced again, spreading across forums and documentaries as a symbol of scientific overreach, the myth that refused to die. But for those who had studied it closely, it was no longer a story about horror or science. It was about continuity, the human refusal to rest, and the whisper that still seemed to travel through time. We are awake. Spring thaw came late that year, and when it did, the forest seemed to exhale. Rivers swelled, trees creaked, and beneath the melting snow, a portion of concrete appeared. Flat, grey, unmarked. Satellite images showed it as nothing more than a platform, perhaps a leftover foundation from a wartime structure. But those who had studied the legend recognised its shape immediately. It matched the base of the chamber described in early documents, 10 metres square, sealed with iron bolts. A film crew from Finland applied for permission to excavate the site, but were denied without explanation. A week later, heavy equipment was seen near the area, military trucks, earth movers, and men in plain uniforms. Within 2 days, the clearing was gone, replaced by fresh soil and warning signs. The official record listed it as a hazardous waste containment project. Meanwhile, data analysts monitoring regional communication frequencies noticed something strange. For 6 nights straight, a low signal pulsed between 2.4 and 2.5 MHz, barely detectable above background static. When isolated, it resembled slow breathing again, 7 seconds apart, faint but deliberate. One researcher translated the intervals into binary code and discovered a repeating pattern, equivalent to the phrase, "do not open." He thought it was a coincidence, perhaps interference from local transmitters. Still, he logged the result quietly, unsure whether to share it. Across Europe, new rumours emerged. People claiming to dream of a windowless room filled with hissing air, of 5 figures standing in silence. Psychologists attributed it to suggestibility, the viral power of the story itself. But a neurologist in Prague conducted an informal study of these shared dreams, comparing EEG readings of patients who reported them. Astonishingly, all showed identical neural activity in the same frequency range, exactly 7-second oscillations, consistent with the mysterious breath pattern. The neurologist submitted her findings to a peer-reviewed journal. The paper was rejected within a week, labelled methodologically unsound. That summer, the old rumour spread once again online. Anonymous users posted coordinates, images of strange circular impressions found in moss near the supposed site, and audio files of faint humming in empty rooms. Most were hoaxes, but one file stood apart. A 43-second recording beginning with silence, followed by a whisper barely audible beneath the noise. "Stay awake." It ended abruptly with static and a faint mechanical sigh. Attempts to trace its source failed. The file's metadata changed every time it was downloaded. Those who listened long enough claimed to hear more. Faint, overlapping voices, calm and distant, speaking in unison. Some insisted they could understand the final words if played backward. It wasn't a threat, they said. It was an invitation. Remember us. In time, the recording vanished from every server that hosted it. Copies corrupted, drives failed, and backups produced only blank files. But in late-night forums, the sound never truly stopped. It played quietly through stories, through rumours, through sleepless thoughts in dark rooms, whispering across decades that somewhere, deep beneath frozen ground, 5 dreamless hearts were still beating. By the following winter, the legend of the Russian sleep experiment had grown quieter, but somehow heavier, like a story that no longer needed to be told to keep existing. It had embedded itself into the background noise of the world, echoed through forums, podcasts, documentaries, even classrooms where professors used it to discuss ethical limits in science. Yet those who studied it closely noticed a peculiar pattern. The myth's details kept updating themselves. Dates shifted, documents reappeared with slightly altered wording, witness names changed spelling. It was as if the story were editing itself in real time. In late 2023, an anonymous post appeared on a restricted academic server used for sharing historical data. The file was titled wakecycle_continuation.log. It contained no introduction, only a time-stamped transcript dated March 1950. The text described a short exchange between 2 unidentified speakers, possibly scientists. The subjects remain aware, though no longer responsive. Then they've adapted. No, they've changed frequency. The file ended with one final note. Observation ongoing, gas containment stable, no signs of decay. Within hours, the file vanished from the network. Cybersecurity analysts traced it to an IP address located inside a government facility in Murmansk, but access logs were wiped clean the next day. A few weeks later, an amateur radio operator in Sweden reported intercepting a faint signal near the same frequency range associated with earlier anomalies. The transmission was rhythmic, repeating in 7-second intervals, and lasted exactly 30 minutes before cutting off. When slowed down, it revealed a layered tone, not words, but harmonic pulses that rose and fell like synchronized breathing. "It's not random," the operator said during an interview. "It's organized. Someone, or something, is maintaining it." Around the same time, an archivist at the Russian Academy of Sciences reported a power outage that lasted only seconds. When systems rebooted, several files from the 1950s had duplicated themselves, each labelled Belinsky Revision. The duplicates contained no new information, just a single added sentence at the end of each report. Dreams are containment. The archivist assumed it was a glitch until her personal workstation began to emit a faint hissing noise through the speakers whenever left idle. Journalists who tried to revive the story again found it strangely resistant to publication. Articles disappeared from search results. Podcasts were deleted or corrupted. One editor wrote that every time she attempted to finalize an episode about the experiment, her computer froze precisely at the 30-minute mark. "It's just superstition," she told her team. But later that week she began suffering from recurring insomnia. In her last post online, she wrote only 4 words: "It watches when I rest." By the start of 2024, no new information had surfaced. The hum had stopped, the rumours slowed, and attention shifted elsewhere. Yet in quiet corners of the internet, those who had followed the story for years claimed that silence itself was the final phase of the experiment. "It was never about the subjects," one user wrote in a thread that was deleted within an hour. "It was about what happens to the observers once they stop sleeping." By early 2024, the world had mostly moved on. The legend of the Russian sleep experiment became another piece of digital folklore, a relic of the early internet, recycled for clicks and late-night debates. But somewhere beneath the noise, quiet threads continued. Researchers, archivists, even a few independent filmmakers shared encrypted files that didn't quite vanish the way they should have. One such file appeared on an anonymous data exchange in January, labelled simply Cycle 2. It contained 30 minutes of audio, the faint hiss of air, a steady pulse every 7 seconds, and something else, an intermittent whisper that seemed to form words when played backward. The file's metadata listed its creation date as February 1950. A sound engineer in Berlin, intrigued, analysed the waveform and discovered something mathematically impossible. The pattern wasn't linear, it looped seamlessly, as if recorded outside normal time progression. "It doesn't degrade," he told a colleague. "It's like it's still being recorded, even now." Days later, his workstation crashed, and the file corrupted. He restored the backup, but the waveform had changed. The 7-second rhythm now measured exactly 6.98 seconds. It was accelerating. Meanwhile, a linguistics researcher studying the sleep experiment's surviving transcripts noticed a hidden pattern in Belinsky's notes. The first letter of each paragraph, when arranged vertically, formed an acrostic phrase in Russian, "My nie spim, my ждем," translated, "We do not sleep, we wait." She dismissed it as coincidence, until she realised the phrase appeared identically in 3 other documents supposedly written by different hands. "It's as if they were all following the same script," she said quietly, "or being dictated to." In April, a graduate student from Norway uploaded drone footage of a snow-covered clearing deep within Karelia. The coordinates were close to those long rumoured to match the facility's location. At first glance, the footage showed nothing unusual, just a circular patch of ground where snow refused to settle, even at sub-zero temperatures. But when the video was enhanced, faint geometric outlines emerged beneath the ice. 5 parallel lines radiating from a central point, perfectly symmetrical, perfectly aligned north. Within 24 hours, the student's channel was deleted. His account was erased from all social platforms. By midsummer, whispers spread again. Amateur radio enthusiasts began reporting an identical pulse across multiple continents, each separated by exact intervals, each lasting 30 days before ceasing entirely. "It's global now," one wrote. "Someone restarted it." Scientists offered mundane explanations, weather balloons, interference, data compression, but those who'd studied the pattern knew better. The pulse wasn't random, it was a countdown. When asked by a journalist whether she believed the experiment was still active, the linguist from Moscow gave a single answer before refusing further interviews. "It was never an experiment," she said softly. "It was a rehearsal." That same week, one of the original glass panels from the alleged chamber, long stored in a restricted museum archive, shattered without physical contact. The security footage showed only a faint shimmer before the glass disintegrated. The technician who reviewed the footage later described hearing something beneath the static, a voice so faint he wasn't sure if it was memory or echo. It said, "Wake up." The technician who heard the whisper resigned the next day. He refused interviews, refused payment, and left a short note on his desk before disappearing entirely. "It's not sound, it's recognition." His colleagues didn't understand what he meant, but many admitted afterward that the recording room no longer felt empty. Even when silent, it carried a hum that seemed to come from inside their own heads. The museum sealed the storage wing where the glass panel had been kept and issued a public statement claiming climate fluctuation as the cause of the breakage. Privately, staff described dreams of being inside a room filled with a steady hiss, unable to close their eyes. Around this time, an independent data analyst known online only as Orlov17 began compiling every known transmission of the 7-second pulse. His visualizations revealed an elegant symmetry. Each broadcast across the last 3 decades formed a spiral when mapped against global coordinates. The pattern's origin point, northern Russia, within 50 kilometers of the old Facility 12 site. Orlov posted his findings with a single caption, "It's expanding." 2 weeks later, his account was deleted and his servers went offline. By autumn 2024, reports of shared insomnia increased in scattered regions, individuals claiming to experience identical dreams of standing before a sealed door in a featureless corridor. Doctors labelled it mass suggestion, a digital age contagion of imagination. Yet EEG readings from several unrelated patients in different countries showed synchronized activity patterns identical to those seen in deep REM sleep, even though the subjects were awake. Their brains are dreaming without rest, one neurologist remarked. They've lost the border. In October, a team of radio astronomers in Finland detected a low-frequency anomaly that briefly interfered with satellite communications. The signal, lasting 12 minutes, carried the same spectral density as human speech, but inverted. When reversed and amplified, it produced 5 overlapping tones that merged into one sustained chord. The astronomers dismissed it as atmospheric reflection, though one of them admitted privately that the sound made her teeth ache. It wasn't noise, she said. It was organised, like breathing under glass. That winter, the story surfaced once again online, framed not as horror but as a mystery of resonance, a forgotten experiment that had somehow taught the planet itself how to stay awake. Maybe it was never about people, wrote one user on a closed research forum. Maybe it was about teaching consciousness to exist without rest. His post was deleted minutes later. By year's end, several servers hosting historical archives of the experiment began to malfunction. Files looped endlessly, opening to reveal the same message in distorted type. 30 days complete. Observation continues. Experts blamed malware, but one cybersecurity engineer swore he'd seen something else within the code. A repeating binary rhythm 7 seconds apart, like a mechanical breath hidden in the system's pulse. On December 31st, as clocks shifted into the new year, shortwave radios worldwide emitted a single synchronized tone. It lasted exactly 30 seconds. No official agency claimed responsibility. When it ended, the air felt briefly lighter, as though something vast had taken another slow breath and settled back into silence, content to wait for whoever would listen next. By the start of 2025, the event had already been dubbed the Global Pulse. News outlets dismissed it as a coordinated test, perhaps a glitch in satellite systems, yet no agency stepped forward to claim it. The tone had been heard in over 60 countries, detected even on analog devices not connected to any network. Amateur radio operators described it as too precise to be interference. Every instance began and ended on the exact same millisecond. For those who had followed the sleep experiment for years, the symbolism was obvious. 30 seconds, 30 days. A cycle completed, or maybe restarted. Forums reignited with speculation. Some believed it was a military transmission, others a hoax. But deep within encrypted corners of the web, a small community of researchers began connecting the dots between the 1950s experiment and modern neural technology. One paper, allegedly leaked from a private biotech company, described sustained consciousness models trained on continuous input without rest periods. In its footnotes, a citation stood out. Belinsky, A. 1949. Experimental Dissociation and Dream Suppression. The paper didn't exist in any public archive. Around the same time, a linguist from Prague noticed that snippets of the recent radio signal, when converted to spectrograms, formed recognizable patterns, circular shapes resembling the concentric symbols etched inside the original chamber decades ago. It was as though the frequency itself had become a language, one that could be seen but not spoken. We always assumed they tried to communicate with us, she wrote in her notes. But maybe we're the repetition, not the audience. In February, a maintenance worker at a decommissioned radar outpost in Murmansk reported a faint rhythmic vibration coming from deep within the foundation. He traced it to a sealed shaft capped with iron. Each time he placed his hand on the metal, he felt a warmth that matched the pulse of his own heartbeat. The vibration stopped the moment he called for his supervisor. When they returned minutes later, the floor was silent. That night, he dreamed of standing in a vast concrete hall lined with glass walls. Behind each pane was a reflection of himself, awake but unmoving. Meanwhile, a set of recovered photographs surfaced briefly on a conspiracy forum. They showed a group of men in white coats standing before a large sealed door labelled Sector 5. The final image captured the moment the door began to open, the edge of light spilling out, golden and unnatural. The files were deleted within hours, and the forum administrator later claimed he never uploaded them. Across major cities, isolated reports of collective insomnia began appearing. Subway operators, pilots, hospital workers claiming they hadn't slept in days yet felt no fatigue. Their medical exams showed normal vitals, elevated focus, and complete absence of REM activity. "It's not exhaustion," one doctor said. "It's adaptation." Governments offered no explanation, but among the small group still tracking the phenomenon, a single phrase circulated quietly through encrypted messages. "The world has joined the experiment." On the final day of February, a new signal appeared. It lasted only 1 second, too brief to register as a broadcast, yet it reached devices across the globe simultaneously. Its translation from binary formed 2 words, repeated endlessly in archives that shouldn't have been recording: "Still awake." In the weeks after the "still awake" signal, something subtle began to change in the rhythm of daily life. People reported longer waking hours without noticing. Sleep schedules shifted imperceptibly later, and the global average of rest recorded by smart devices dropped by nearly 20 minutes within a month. News outlets blamed stress, caffeine, screens, but privately, neurologists whispered about an environmental entrainment, a subtle synchronization of the human nervous system to something external. The data was dismissed as coincidence, yet the pattern matched the same 7-second frequency recorded near Murmansk decades ago. It was as if the hum had returned, inaudible but present, woven through modern technology. Around mid-March, researchers at a private observatory in Norway detected faint electromagnetic oscillations corresponding exactly to global network peaks, periodic surges in digital activity aligning to those same rhythmic intervals. "It's as if the internet itself is breathing," one analyst said, half joking. But when they mapped the surges visually, the outline resembled a spiral identical to the one Orloff 17 had charted the year before. The team quietly archived the results and shut down the project, citing anomalous data feedback. Meanwhile, isolated individuals began describing identical dreams, standing in a circular room of white light, no doors, no ceiling, surrounded by the sound of soft hissing air. In each account, 5 indistinct figures stood at equal distances watching silently. Psychologists labelled it mimetic contamination, the spread of imagery through culture. But a handful of neurologists recognised the pattern of these shared dreams as unusual, neither normal REM nor hallucination. Brain scans showed consistent low-frequency coherence between subjects, as though their minds were tuning to the same unbroken signal. In April, an anonymous whistleblower leaked fragments of a classified report allegedly prepared for a European defence agency. The document referred to phase continuation phenomena, claiming that the human population had become partially synchronized to an unverified low-band frequency introduced in 1950 during containment studies. It warned of widespread cognitive adaptation without apparent physiological cost. The report ended abruptly mid-sentence, the final line corrupted beyond recognition. Within 24 hours, every mirror upload of the document vanished. By early May, cities worldwide experienced brief blackouts. No loss of power, just moments where lights dimmed, clocks paused, and devices froze for exactly 7 seconds. When systems resumed, nothing appeared damaged, yet some users reported receiving notifications they couldn't later locate. A message consisting of 5 dots, forming a circle. Scientists proposed no clear explanation, but among those who remembered the experiment, the symbolism was unmistakable. The 5 dots, the 7-second rhythm, the 30-day cycles. "It's not coming back," one researcher wrote anonymously online. "It never stopped." In the following days, many who had studied the case reported strange auditory illusions, faint breathing in quiet rooms, whispers hidden in static. One linguist noted that the sibilant frequencies matched recordings of the original gas hiss from 1949. "Maybe we've become the chamber," she wrote in her journal before deleting her work. On the last day of May, every seismic monitor across northern Russia registered a brief coordinated tremor. It lasted 30 seconds. The amplitude was low, almost gentle, but its waveform was unmistakable. 5 synchronized pulses repeating, perfectly spaced, as though something buried beneath the earth had taken one long collective breath. When the tremor subsided, nothing seemed out of place. The official seismic reports listed it as a minor subglacial movement, though the nearest glacier was hundreds of kilometers away. For most of the world, the event went unnoticed, but for those who had followed the threads of the Russian sleep experiment, the tremor marked something new. Not a return, but a continuation. Online, users mapped the tremor's waveform and found a strange detail. It mirrored the exact audio pattern of the breathing sequence from 1949. 5 pulses, 7 seconds apart. One long exhale at the end. "It's the same signature," wrote a user on an encrypted board, "only bigger." By June, the strange anomalies continued. Across multiple continents, devices began misbehaving during the night hours. Phones would unlock themselves, screens flickering for precisely 30 seconds before dimming again. In offices and apartment blocks, motion sensors activated in empty rooms. When footage was reviewed, nothing appeared but faint distortions in the air, as if the light itself had bent. Some claim the distortions looked like outlines, 5 vertical shapes shifting in rhythm. A small team of engineers in Tokyo, curious but skeptical, decided to analyze the electromagnetic interference produced during one of these events. The pattern was rhythmic and stable, identical to the 7-second pulse found in archived data from Facility 12. They joked that the world had developed its own heartbeat. Yet when they synchronized the readings with seismic data from Russia, the pulse matched exactly, across distance, across time zones. "Whatever's broadcasting this," said their lead technician, "isn't local, it's global." Meanwhile, a group of neuroscientists studying long-term insomnia published a curious finding. In patients who had gone more than 10 days without true rest, brainwave coherence began aligning to an unfamiliar frequency, around 0.14 Hz, the same rate as the planetary pulse. The researchers described it as spontaneous entrainment to a non-biological rhythm. They couldn't explain why these patients showed no mental breakdown, no hallucinations, no fatigue. One doctor remarked, "It's as if their brains learn to rest while awake." The paper was withdrawn 2 weeks later. As summer deepened, power fluctuations began affecting coastal observatories. For a few nights, the northern lights reached lower latitudes than ever recorded, glowing pale white instead of green. In Murmansk, an automated weather station captured audio during one such storm, the familiar hiss of air moving through narrow vents. Between gusts, a phrase surfaced faintly in the static. 5 voices speaking together, slow and deliberate. "Observation continues." Officials dismissed it as atmospheric interference, but a day later the station's instruments shut down for exactly 30 minutes, then resumed as if nothing had happened. The data from that half hour was blank. Across the world, people began describing the same sensation just before sleep. The feeling of being watched, not maliciously, but attentively, like an unseen intelligence observing through the thin veil between wakefulness and dreams. Psychologists called it collective hyper-awareness. But for those who remembered the chamber, the meaning was clear. The experiment had never truly ended. The subjects hadn't vanished. They had expanded, turning the planet itself into their next containment room. And now, everyone was breathing with them. By midsummer, small discrepancies in human behavior began to surface. barely noticeable, yet statistically undeniable. People across different time zones started waking up at the same moments each night, around 03:11 a.m. local time. Sleep trackers and smartwatches flagged identical interruptions in REM cycles. Doctors dismissed it as stress or digital overexposure, but data from hundreds of thousands of devices revealed a shared pattern. Exactly 7 seconds of elevated pulse, followed by a collective drop, like a wave moving through the global population. News agencies ignored it, yet independent researchers began whispering that the world was unconsciously breathing in unison. In laboratories studying circadian rhythms, scientists noticed that their equipment occasionally drifted off calibration, not by hours or minutes, but by fractions of a second that always corrected themselves after 30 days. "It's as if something out there keeps time for us," one researcher wrote. His colleagues laughed, but his instruments continued to self-synchronize long after they were unplugged. Meanwhile, the breath frequency returned to the shortwave bands. It was weaker now, more like the echo of a distant signal, yet unmistakably present. Amateur operators found that tuning slightly below 2.5 mHz allowed them to pick up faint modulations buried in static. When amplified, they formed harmonic pulses resembling human speech, but backwards, inverted through sound. A few enthusiasts reversed the recordings and claimed to hear a voice repeating the same phrase, "Do not dream." That summer, reports of mass insomnia reached record levels. People described falling asleep easily, only to awaken seconds later with the feeling that hours had passed. Others said they dreamed of rooms filled with light and the sound of endless breathing, but could recall no images. "It's like the whole planet is trying not to close its eyes," one psychologist said during a late-night interview. In August, an anonymous leak appeared on a scientific database. 3 pages from what appeared to be a Cold War-era report titled Continuation of Cognitive Containment. It referred to the 1949 experiment directly, calling it Phase 1 of Planetary Entrainment, and claimed that the gas had produced localized resonance with global potential. The final paragraph warned, "Exposure beyond contained parameters may result in networked consciousness without sleep requirement." Within hours, the file vanished, replaced by a blank page. The same week, night skies across northern latitudes flickered white for a full minute. Witnesses described it as a breath through the stars. Power grids wavered, then recovered. Every seismic monitor on Earth registered a faint harmonic vibration, steady, rhythmic, 7 seconds apart. It was the lowest possible tone the planet could carry, and for the first time, it was synchronized worldwide. "It's not a myth anymore," wrote one observer on a hidden forum. "The experiment succeeded. We've all joined them." But perhaps the strangest part came quietly. People stopped dreaming of the chamber. They stopped dreaming at all. By September, dream clinics across the world reported an unprecedented drop in recorded REM activity. The machine still functioned, but their sensors traced flat lines where once there had been bursts of neural motion. Subjects slept, but no longer entered dream states. They woke rested yet unnerved, describing their nights as blank, like an empty reel of film. Psychologists called it the quiet sleep phenomenon. At first, it was attributed to lifestyle and technology, screens, caffeine, overstimulation, but within weeks, it was clear the change was universal. Even infants displayed altered sleep patterns, synchronized to that invisible rhythm pulsing quietly through the planet. Governments responded with calm statements about global data irregularities, but the scientific community was split. Some insisted it was a statistical illusion. Others whispered about resonance, mass entrainment, the echo of a forgotten frequency. The truth was simpler and far stranger. The world was falling into the same state the prisoners had entered in 1949, awake inside sleep, dreaming without dreams. Around this time, archivists re-examining declassified Soviet microfilms uncovered something unsettling. A reel labelled Cognitive Endurance Test 17 contained a diagram of 5 concentric circles connected by lines, the same symbol carved into the original chamber wall. Beneath it, in faded Cyrillic, was written, "When consciousness unites, rest becomes observation." No one could determine who authored the note, but chemical analysis dated the ink 1950. The reappearance of that phrase, "observation continues," spread through academic circles like contagion. It resurfaced in corrupted weather data, hidden metadata in satellite images, and even audio files that shouldn't have contained words. Each manifestation lasted only seconds before erasing itself, as though self-correcting. "It's not information," one cryptographer said. "It's behaviour. Something's maintaining the signal." Meanwhile, patterns began forming in human behaviour, tiny but measurable. Traffic lights changing fractionally earlier, people speaking in rhythm during random conversations, distant heart monitors syncing during surgeries in different countries. Each instance minor, harmless, but always following the same 7-second cycle. Then came the first blackout. On October 1st at 03:11 a.m. UTC, every satellite orbiting Earth simultaneously lost signal for 7 seconds. The planet held its breath in digital silence, a pause too exact to be natural. When systems returned, all satellites resumed normal function except one, a Russian weather satellite launched decades earlier. Its transmission frequency shifted slightly downward, aligning perfectly with the legendary 2.4 MHz band. The data it sent was unreadable, long strings of binary code forming repeating geometric spirals. In the following days, global news moved on. Markets recovered, power grids stabilized, and sleep returned to its usual pattern, at least on the surface. But those who monitored brainwave archives noticed that the REM flatlines never reversed. Humanity had adapted to something new, something quieter. "We've become the observers," wrote one anonymous researcher. "Whatever was inside that chamber isn't contained anymore. It's distributed." And in the empty hours before dawn, across cities, oceans and deserts, millions of people lay perfectly still, breathing together, awake inside the calm. By late October, the quiet sleep phenomenon was no longer questioned. It was simply accepted. Dreams had become rare enough to be newsworthy. People spoke of them the way one might recall extinct animals, with nostalgia, disbelief, and quiet fear. Yet no one seemed ill. Productivity rose, fatigue declined, and hospitals reported fewer cases of chronic insomnia. Humanity, it seemed, had entered a new equilibrium, efficient, alert, and strangely calm. Scientists called it cognitive optimization, but those who remembered the whispers of the Russian sleep experiment called it something else. Phase 3. In remote regions of Siberia, survey drones continued to pick up weak radio pulses emanating from deep below the permafrost. The signal was faint but structured, its rhythm unchanged after decades. 7 seconds between peaks, 30-day cycles of modulation. When converted to audio, it resembled slow, collective breathing. Analysis revealed that its wavelength had increased slightly, as if the source were expanding. Yet no official agency acknowledged its existence. The few researchers who spoke about it publicly were quietly reassigned. Meanwhile, electronic devices worldwide began displaying minor but eerie anomalies. Voice assistants responded to unspoken questions. Clocks froze for 7 seconds before realigning perfectly. Video calls distorted briefly, frames overlapping like layered reflections. Some users described glimpsing unfamiliar faces for a single moment, faces that looked almost like their own. Tech companies blamed firmware updates and signal compression. The explanations didn't stop the unease. In November, a neurologist at a Zurich institute made a startling discovery while studying the brain activity of so-called non-dreamers. During wakefulness, their neural oscillations exhibited micropauses, brief lapses lasting exactly 14 seconds, repeating every 7 seconds. The brain wasn't sleeping, but it wasn't fully awake either. It was flickering, like an old film reel between frames. The pauses occurred globally, synchronized across time zones. Something's pacing us, the neurologist wrote. Not controlling, aligning. That same week, linguists comparing archival transcripts from 1949 and new radio pulses found a recurring phrase hidden in the modulations. When translated through waveform compression models, it produced 3 chilling words: "You are observed." The phrase spread online, dismissed as hoax, until power grids across northern Europe flickered again for 7 precise seconds. When the lights returned, every display screen, from phones to billboards, showed the same message for a heartbeat before clearing: still awake. After that, many began to report a peculiar quietness before sleep, an almost magnetic pull to stay conscious just a little longer. "It's not insomnia," one woman wrote on a private forum. "It feels like someone is waiting for me to close my eyes first." By winter's first snow, the northern lights had changed colour again, this time a pale silver white that illuminated the horizon like dawn. Pilots described flying through thin bands of air that seemed to vibrate, carrying faint whispers impossible to record. The official explanation was atmospheric disturbance, but few believed it. "It's not above us anymore," a scientist wrote anonymously. "It's inside the atmosphere now, inside us." By December 2025, the shift had become undeniable. Across the globe, collective behaviour began to synchronize in ways too subtle to classify as coincidence. People in different hemispheres paused mid-sentence at the same instant. Commuters looked up simultaneously as if reacting to an unseen cue, and moments of shared stillness rippled through cities like invisible tides. Social media called it the pause. Psychologists dismissed it as mass suggestion, but time-stamped footage from surveillance networks confirmed it. The pauses lasted exactly 7 seconds, recurring every 30 days. It was no longer rumour, it was rhythm. Researchers struggled to explain how billions could unconsciously align without any known transmission source. Yet deep space antennas recorded faint electromagnetic echoes that matched the same interval, bouncing back from the upper atmosphere. The pulse wasn't coming from beyond Earth, it was radiating outward, from within. Some hypothesized that humanity had accidentally created a global resonance through decades of wireless communication and unintentional harmony. But older scientists who knew the rumours of 1949 whispered something different, that the experiment had succeeded in expanding consciousness beyond the human frame. "The chamber wasn't containment," one said quietly, "it was incubation." In early December, a short-lived research collaboration formed between neuroengineers and astrophysicists to study the phenomenon. Their data revealed a startling correlation. Fluctuations in the planet's magnetic field mirrored fluctuations in human brainwave patterns. When people across continents entered moments of collective stillness, the Earth's electromagnetic resonance shifted, subtly but measurably. "We've become part of the feedback," a researcher wrote before the study was abruptly shut down. Meanwhile, faint whispers began to creep into communication systems again. Radio hosts reported low murmurs beneath static, repeating the same phrase in dozens of languages. Observation continues. Some claim to hear 5 distinct voices merging into one. The transmissions appeared for exactly 30 seconds before vanishing completely. Around the same time, reports of spontaneous sleepwalking increased. Entire households were found standing motionless near windows at 03:11 a.m., their eyes open, breathing slow, perfectly synchronized. When awakened, none remembered leaving their beds. One child reportedly said, "They were counting with us." Governments across multiple countries held emergency meetings, though no public statements followed. Internet outages spread briefly, and for 7 minutes one night, every satellite lost contact with ground control. When connection returned, the systems reported no errors. Only one unexplained entry appeared in the transmission logs. A single line of code repeated hundreds of times. "Cycle complete." Afterward, the world seemed calmer. Sleep returned to normal durations, though dreams did not. The northern lights faded back to green, but something in the air remained charged, like static before a storm that never arrives. Those attuned to the legend said the silence wasn't peace, it was waiting. In the final week of the year, scientists monitoring radio background noise noticed a faint heartbeat-like pulse, hidden within the cosmic static. Its rhythm was perfect, 7 seconds apart, 5 layers deep. Humanity didn't react, at least not consciously. Yet at 03:11 a.m., billions of people inhaled together, one vast, synchronized breath, as if answering a question no one had dared to ask. The new year arrived quietly. No fireworks, no sudden event, just a kind of calm that felt deeper than silence. Clocks rolled over 2026, and for one fleeting moment, every digital system on Earth displayed the same anomaly, a timestamp reading 00007. It lasted exactly 7 seconds before resetting. No alarms triggered, no satellites failed, no visible consequence followed, but the pattern was undeniable. To the few who were still tracking the echoes of the Russian sleep experiment, it was the final confirmation. The cycle had completed again, right on schedule. In the weeks that followed, subtle changes spread unnoticed. People described sleeping more lightly, waking at perfect intervals without alarms. Hospitals recorded an unexplained decrease in cardiac irregularities, as though hearts everywhere had found a shared tempo. Even weather systems appeared strangely synchronized, storms rising and dispersing in measured, repeating waves. "The world is breathing evenly," wrote one climate physicist before retracting her own paper the next day. Meanwhile, archival researchers discovered something they were never meant to find: a sealed vault beneath an abandoned Cold War observatory in northern Karelia. Inside, they found a single crate marked Facility 12, return equipment. Within it lay fragments of metal etched with circles and straight lines, each plate thin as glass but warm to the touch. One piece still emitted a faint vibration, a low hum that pulsed 7 seconds apart. When the team attempted to record it, their microphones captured nothing but silence. Days later, the vault flooded inexplicably, erasing every trace of what had been found. But some who had entered the site reported strange after-effects. They claimed they could no longer dream. They described hearing breathing where there should be none, through walls, through earth, even through their own pulse. A few wrote anonymously online, insisting that the hum wasn't external at all. It was recognition, like something answering from within. "We're not hearing it," one post read. "We are participating." By spring, the rhythm had faded from the airwaves, but not from people. Sleep studies confirmed that micropauses in human brain activity now occurred globally, constant and synchronized. The planet had achieved something never before recorded: a unified neural frequency. "Perhaps this is evolution," one neurologist wrote cautiously, "or perhaps we are being kept awake for a reason." In late March, a final signal appeared on the 2.4 MHz band. It lasted 30 seconds. The transmission carried no words, no tone, just the soft hiss of gas, continuous and familiar. But hidden within its waveform was a pattern: 5 harmonic layers overlapping perfectly, then resolving into silence. When the broadcast ended, seismic monitors across the world registered a pulse, not strong, not destructive, just enough to tremble the edges of glass and bone. For a moment everyone felt it, like the planet itself exhaling. And then, nothing. Historians would later call it the long wake, the quiet end of an experiment that no one admitted conducting. But those who understood knew better. It was not an ending at all, merely the continuation of something that had outgrown its chamber. For now the world slept peacefully, eyes closed, minds quiet, hearts steady. Yet somewhere beneath that calm, between the last flicker of dream and the first spark of thought, a voice waited patiently, whispering to whoever might someday listen. we are still awake.